and I'm your favorite magic channel's favorite magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword, Mark.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and I figured I'd try and sneak one more holiday deck tech up under the tree for you. We're going to stick with the Pauper format, because that's the gift that keeps on giving. And since it's Christmas Eve, what better subject matter than elves? You might be tempted not to take Santa's Little Helper seriously at first, but trust me, this deck straight slays. Christmas puns. Anyway, the deck is a huge chunk of the Pauper meta right now. It's a very serious deck in the format, and it's not hard to see why, you know. This deck is super explosive. We're dumping a bunch of cardboard onto the table in just the first 3 turns with this deck, and we're taking advantage of the fact that Pauper is a format that lacks really good sweepers. There's a couple of things that we got to worry about, but for the most part, we're more safe overextending in Pauper than we are in most formats, and this deck takes full advantage of that. Crazy synergy, insane late game. In fact, some of the stuff you can do in the late game with a board full of elves is just downright broken. There's no other word for it. So let me show you what we got going on in the workshop. Well, we're going to start with some low-level personnel that's been around for freaking ever. You got to really respect the amount of work these guys have put in over the years. We're going to play 4 copies of Elvish Mystic and 3 copies of Lawnmower Elves. Or as we used to call them back in the day, Lawnmower Elves. Good times. But anyway, you can switch these up if you want to, or you can even play Findhorn Elves if you want to do that. Just go crazy, knock yourself out, so long as you have anywhere between usually 4 and what I've done here, 7 1-mana elves. You know, we're not playing a lot of lands in this deck. We function on just 1 or 2 lands, you know, but we're looking at these guys as essentially an extension of the mana base. So we got to play at least a few of them, and of course we're going to play them. Like, they were deemed too powerful for standard a few years ago. That's lightning bolt status, so we got to play them. Now, secretly, one of the most important elves in the entire deck is Birchclaw Rangers. These things do a lot. Now, believe it or not, this is not a mono-green elves deck. This is a blue-green elves deck, and some versions of this deck are actually teamers, so they can include 1 red card. And in this and many other versions of the deck, this is the only way to get colored mana that we have access to. Some decks will play like 1 island, and then some decks will play like 4 copies of Sylvan Ranger to go get that island. I think that Sylvan Ranger is a little too bad of a card in a lot of ways compared to the elves we could be playing, at least. So Birchclaw Rangers is my only source of getting blue mana in the deck as well, but that's fine. We've only got 1 blue card in the entire list. You'd be surprised what a Loam Dryad with a really good creature type can do, especially in a deck like this. You know, it's not just making, you know, non-green colored mana that's important. That is very important, yes, but the card does all kinds of other stuff in the deck, combos with a few different elements that you'll see coming up, and I'll point that out when we get there. But just know, bottom line, Birchclaw Rangers is integral to what the deck is trying to do. Now, we're also going to play 4 copies of Nettle Sentinel, and this is honestly one of the, if not the, best 1-drop in the entire format here. I think Delver of Secrets probably beats it out for the #1 slot, but there aren't a whole lot of better 1-drops than Nettle Sentinel. The thing is stacked. And by the way, this is one of those cards that combos with Birchclaw Rangers really well. I was just talking about that. You know, essentially we can tap Nettle Sentinel and any one of our other creatures for any color mana from Birchclaw Rangers, and then when we cast the spell that we're drawing mana for, it's very likely going to be a green spell, so we just go ahead and untap Nettle Sentinel. That's actually kind of extremely powerful. Speaking of extremely powerful, we're also going to play 4 copies of Kyrian Ranger here. Now, if this is your first time seeing this card, it might not be immediately apparent how insane this thing is, but trust me, it is insane. I was super stoked to be able to play with this thing again. Back in the day, like 20 years ago when it first came out, this is a card that was almost universally loved because it's essentially just like a value engine. You know, the amount of stuff this thing can do for you is crazy. Now, we still have the really old trick, the way back in the day trick of like, you know, tap a mana elf, tap a forest for mana, and then you can send the forest back to your hand with Kyrian Ranger, untap your elf. At this point, you got 2 mana floating, and you've got 2 untapped mana on the battlefield when you play that forest again. So this is crazy. That's really good ramp for just, you know, your 1 mana Kyrian Ranger. But in this deck, we've got a bunch more tricks than just that one. And where things get really crazy is that we've got 3 different creatures in the deck that tap for just insanely splashy, bomby, crazy activated abilities on a board full of elves. And getting another activation every turn out of them with a Kyrian Ranger is just like, that's going to force scoops sometimes. That itself will win you the game. And even if your opponent hangs in there, it's just too much value. Again, this thing is an unbelievable value engine that is very easy to underestimate at first, but don't make that mistake. You know, there's just so much interaction. How much value can you squeeze out of a Kyrian Ranger over the course of a game? The answer is a lot. Like, I'm not even done. Like, Nettle Sentinel, this is an easy way to untap your Nettle Sentinel. If you can't figure out any other way to do it, you don't have any cards in hand, this is a great way to untap Sentinel. And it's good with Birchclaw Rangers too, yet another card that combos with Rangers because it's another easy way to untap a creature that you tapped with Birchclaw. So the amount of interaction this card has in this deck is just off the charts, one of the most important cards in the deck. Now, speaking of those elves that tap for, like, unfair activated abilities, I might as well go ahead and show you a few of those. Starting with the 3 copies of Priest of Titania, which never had any business being a common. The amount of mana this thing can make for you in the late game and even the mid game is unconscionable. No reason for it to exist. And you might think, too, that in this deck, we're top decking. You know, starting like turn 4, we're just going to be in top deck mode. There's no reason to want all that mana in the late game. But trust me, there is. We'll get to it a little bit later. There are definitely going to be times where you'll tap this thing for like 7-8 mana and you'll use every last ounce of that mana on turn 9. So, just letting you know, I know that it looks like it doesn't do a whole lot even if it taps for 10 mana in the late game, but trust me, it does everything. Plus, honestly, you won't be complaining about top deck mode when you play this on turn 2, and then on turn 3 it allows you to completely empty your hand. So, you know, there are times you'll get this in the early game, and it'll be completely worth it even if you never tap it again after turn 4. We're also going to play 3 copies of Well-Wisher. Talk about unfair to untap with Kyrian Ranger, man. Like, this is just unbelievable sometimes, even if you're not playing against, like, another aggro deck or a burn deck. That's obviously the decks against which Well-Wisher shines, but even against other lists, Well-Wisher is just insane. It can put the game out of reach and, like, just taps for 10 life every turn, sometimes 20, because you get to tap it twice if you got a Kyrian Ranger out. That's just, it's too much. It's too much, and people will scoop to a Well-Wisher if they don't have an answer to it, you know. You'll play your Well-Wisher. This is only occasionally, but it's happened to me more than once in messing around with this deck to present it to you, you know. You'll just play Well-Wisher, you'll say go, they'll go, not draw removal, and scoop the game to you because they know that if you, especially if you've got a Ranger out, you're just going to gain like 16 life every turn, and there's nothing they can do about it, especially in Pauper. If they can't remove the thing immediately, you're just going to get too much life out of it for them to, you know, even want to continue the game. So, Well-Wisher's obviously insane, and is especially good in a couple of matchups that we're not great in, like other aggro that can overpower us sometimes, even though we're very explosive. Well-Wisher's a great insurance policy against goblins and such, and it's obviously one of the best cards we could ever draw against Burn, too, which is a deck that can sometimes be good against us. The deck also plays 3 copies of Elvish Visionary, because why not? You know, 2 mana for a body with synergy and a card is a great deal. It allows us to blast through our deck super quick and give us a body for all the stuff that, like, cares about there being a lot of elves on the battlefield. So, play at least 3, if not 4. But I will say this is one of the cards I end up sideboarding out the most often. It's one of the cards I look to sideboard out the most, you know. It doesn't necessarily, you know, it doesn't have an activated ability, it doesn't tap for mana or anything. Once it's in play, it's just a vanilla 1/1. So I end up sideboarding this out a good bit, so I don't think 4 copies is entirely necessary, but we'll definitely play at least 3. Visionary is pretty much always good. Drawing cards is good. Who knew? But moving on, we're also going to play 4 copies of Elvish Vanguard, which at one point in its lifespan was a rare. This was at one point a rare, but it got downshifted to common, and we will definitely take it. That's really good in Pauper. This essentially gets at least 1 counter nearly every single turn. Again, the land count is super low in this deck, so even when we are in top deck mode, we are still very likely to draw an elf. So, with that in mind, this thing gets a counter nearly every turn, and if the game goes more than a few turns after we play it, then suddenly it's the biggest creature in the deck. So, Elvish Vanguard is not to be overlooked. It doesn't really look like much at first, but trust me, again, this thing becomes the biggest creature in the deck in just a matter of a couple of turns. But that can't be the only big thing we have, so we're also going to play 4 copies of Timberwatch Elf, which isn't necessarily in and of itself a big creature, but it can make other creatures freaking enormous. And it's another thing that's easy to exploit with Kyrion Ranger. You know, if you get an untap out of this every turn, then you're essentially making 2 of your guys unbelievably huge on the right board. And obviously, it's not hard to cultivate the right board. Like, again, not at all impossible to just have, like, anywhere between 5 and 10, especially in the late game, elves on the battlefield. And just being able to be like, that guy gets +6/+6 is crazy and will help break stalemates, and especially being able to do it twice in a turn when you have your ranger out, that's game. A lot of the time, that is game. And to finish the creatures off here, took a while, there's a lot of them, but we're going to play 4 copies of Lissalana Huntmaster, which is actually insane for a 4-drop common elf that never really saw any play and no one ever cared about. This is something that can put like a total of 4, 5, 6, extra elves out over the course of a game. Getting multiples is insane. It combos well with Timberwatch elves, it combos well with Vanguard for that matter. Just so many good reasons to play this for flooding the board. Obviously, we get more value out of Well-Wisher too with this thing, more value out of Priest. There's just 100 reasons to play Huntmaster. Now that was 40 creatures, believe it or not. That was 40 whole creatures, but we still have room to play some spells in this deck. I've already told you that the land count is drastically low in this deck, but I love that. I just said that the other day. I love decks that get to play very, very few lands, and this is definitely maybe the best example of that in the format, unless you want to count One Land Spy. But in any case, this is probably the best low land deck in this or many other formats, actually. This deck is really powerful, even outside of Pauper. But a big reason for why we get to play so few lands, obviously, is all of our mana dorks that tap for mana, but it's also the fact that we're playing 4 copies of Land Grant. Now, this is another card that I used to love, but have not played with in a very, very long time. And in Vintage, in other formats, Land Grant is still sometimes a very important card when it comes to lowering land counts, especially considering in those formats, it can go and get like dual lands, which is crazy. We can't do that in Pauper, but it still makes us, be able to keep 0 land hands when we start the game. If we've got no lands, a Land Grant, and Llanowar Elves, we're set. We're totally set. Go get your free forest, play your Llanowar Elves, and then you're done. You're set for the rest of the game. In most cases, even if you never draw another forest, you've got enough mana. So, Land Grant just makes it to where we play almost no lands and get away with it. We're also going to play 4 copies of Lead the Stampede. This is just an awesome refill. This isn't the best refill in the deck. As a matter of fact, the other refill is the entire reason we're playing blue at all, but this is still quite a good one, considering we're playing, again, almost no lands and like 40 different elves. This thing can put a full grip right back into our hand for just 3 mana. And we've got all the mana, we can pay the 3 mana for this, and then tap Priest of Titania, and just play every elf that we just put into our hand with a Lead the Stampede. It's just, this is one of those decks that, it can be built a few different ways, but you will always, without fail, see 4 Lead the Stampede in the deck. It's that important, and it can just lead to, crazy shifts on turn 4, let's say you're playing against some kind of control deck or a deck with a bunch of removal, then maybe they'll remove 1 or 2 of your elves in the opening turns. Well, that's when you can just cast Lead the Stampede, refill your hand, and then suddenly they're screwed because in the next couple of turns, you're going to play 6 elves. So, Lead the Stampede is insanely important. It's one of the best refills we could possibly play. But the best refill that we could play is Distant Melody, and that's why we're playing 3. Now, you'll see anywhere between 2 copies of Melody and 4 copies of Distant Melody. As a matter of fact, I think it's still very popular to play all 4 Distant Melody. Now, I don't think it's entirely necessary, although there's a reason that it's the only blue card in the deck. Now, even if Melody only draws you 4 cards, you drew 4 for 4 mana, but there are odd times where late in the game, Distant Melody is going to draw you 8, 10 cards even sometimes, and that's just dumb. And it's not like you can't just cast them. If you've got that much, if you've got that many elves out to draw that many cards, chances are you've probably got a Priest of Titania you can tap for 8 to 10 mana, and at that point, you just play all 8 of the elves you just drew, It's not that tough. So, Distant Melody is just freaking nuts. It feels too overpowered to be a common, the things this thing can do in this deck. You'll be at the brink of nothing, and then suddenly you'll just fill your board out of nowhere, win the game, have no business winning, but you just will, because Distant Melody just put 8 cards in your hand, all of which you can just go ahead and cast. It's crazy. You don't know the power of Distant Melody until you've played it with 7+ elves on the battlefield. And here's our mana base right here, 9 forests. 9 forests. Now the mana base does vary drastically, but usually if somebody doesn't play land grant, in their spell base, they'll just play 4 more forests. Like you'll see 13 forests. Sometimes you'll see 13 forests and an island. Already talked about that. They'll play Sylvan Ranger in the deck to go fetch up the island. But especially as of late, a lot of people have not really found that important, and I didn't find it important messing around with the deck. I would much rather just run this plan with land grant and as few lands as possible. Now, this is another one of those decks where the sideboard is varied enough that I'm not just going to give you a rote sideboard and send you out into the world. This is what you want to play. Instead, I'm going to give you a bunch of different options that tend to show up in sideboards of this list. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, first of all, you really do want to protect against what wraths are in the format, notably Electrickery. There's a couple of others, but Tron tends to play Electrickery in the main board as a 1 or 2 of, and we really have to protect against that. And they can go get it anytime they want with Mystical Teachings. So we are really worried about Electrickery and a couple of other things. So with that in mind, we're going to play Spider Silk Armor in a lot of these sideboards to help put us a little bit out of position of Electrickery, and we'll play Rapid Vigor for the same reason. A lot of these decks will even slip in a copy or 2 of Magnify because it's really versatile. Obviously we can go over the top and just Alpha Strike with the Magnify, but Magnify is also a way to go over electricity or Electrickery at instant speed. You'll also usually see at least some number of Gleeful Sabotage in these sideboards. The most popular number I think to see is 3, but you'll see 2, 3, 4 sometimes. And this is basically just a way to completely screw Affinity, on the right, with the right board state. You can just 3-for-1 them with this card, and it's just not fair, and it will end the game. So, against Affinity, Sabotage is amazing. In the Burn matchup, we sometimes have problems. I've already mentioned this, but occasionally Burn will just go to the face all game against us while we're trying to develop a game plan. If we never draw a Well-Wisher, we can be in a little bit of trouble because they don't worry about killing our elves. They're just trying to race us with face damage. And in those matchups, Luminescent Rain can come in handy, as can copies of Essence Warden that you'll occasionally see. And you'll usually see a 4th copy of Well-Wisher on the board for just this situation too. You'll see Scattershot Archer an awful lot too, a really popular green sideboard card in this format. So I just wanted to point out that of course you'll see Archer a lot. It too is an elf, so it's even more important in a lot of these sideboards. But you'll also see Viridian Longbow, and you'll see this as a 1 of in a lot of main decks too. This is great against 1 toughness creatures, and it's like a clock, a non-combat damage clock for games where you need one, like Turbo Fog and stuff like that. But this is also essentially just removal against 1 toughness creatures. Occasionally you'll see Elvish Branchbender or Ulamog's Crusher very, very sparingly in the main deck, but more often in the sideboard for those odd matches where it's better to have one huge guy than a bunch of little tiny dudes. And finally, sometimes you'll see Mob Justice in the board, and occasionally you'll see a 1 of in the main deck too, because again, we've got Birchclaw Rangers, we're already making blue with them, so we might as well, make them our only red source too. That's the way this deck is teamer occasionally. But sometimes you'll see this in the board too. This is just another non-combat damage way of finishing a deck off, whether you're in a stalemate or you're playing against Turbo Fog or whatever. This can just be a way that if you can't get your dudes through for damage or for win, you can just end it all right there.
Your power rankings right here. Final score of 60, really good. For a Pauper deck, actually, that's pretty darn competitive. And this thing can actually go toe-to-toe with decks from other formats. Throw it through your standard gauntlet and see how well it does. There's not a whole lot of decks that can deal with something like this, no matter what format you're in. It's just extremely high synergy. The deck's looking to put itself in a very specific board state. The deck really wants to have a board state going on where there's anywhere between 5 and 8 or plus 8 or more elves on the battlefield, and then it can capitalize on that situation in a variety of disgusting ways, whether it's gaining all the life in the world, making extremely huge dudes, making all the mana you could ever want, drawing 8 cards for 4 mana. There's just so many things this deck can do with its preferred board state, and it puts itself into that board state really, really consistently, we'll say.
And the reason I love this deck so much is that it feels like an Elves deck. This is what an Elves deck should do, empty your hands super fast and then take advantage of the synergy between all of your elves. That's what Elves has always done, and this deck does it almost to perfection. So if you've always liked the Elves playstyle and Modern or Commander or whatever, this is the deck for you. This feels very much like a pure Elves deck down to the core. We're only playing 9 lands. We've got a bunch of mana dorks. All of our elves with activated abilities that don't produce mana do filthy, broken stuff, when we've got the right number of elves out. And that's how an elves deck should play. And this deck is pretty much as far as I can tell, the quintessential elves deck. This feels more like playing elves than any elves deck I've ever played, if that makes sense. And the best part, by the way, is that it's super cheap. Like, obviously, I know this is Pauper, but in Pauper, there are decks that cost north of $100, especially some of the more competitive decks will cost well over $100 because they use like crazy pieces that are tough to find, or only got printed once, and they're extremely popular in this format, so everyone's looking for them. So decks get relatively expensive sometimes, but not this one. This version that I've shown you right here without a sideboard is only like $35 or $40 on TCG Player. That is not much to ask. That is a really, really low budget standard deck. And if you add some of the sideboard pieces that I mentioned, you're really not going to get above $50 or $60 at the end of the day for this deck. And you can build it for way cheaper even than that. And if you wanted to sit down, check this list out all in one place at your leisure, or if you just wanted a quick and easy way to buy this deck for hella cheap, just click the very first link in the description box down there. That'll take you over to TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, and they're where you can get this deck for the cheapest online right now. Just $35-$40. This thing can get sent straight to your door, and you can start wrecking face with it. So help them out, and it helps me out when you click the link, and I'm the one working on Christmas. So help me out, click that link. You should also do the YouTube stuff if you're still here. Just click the like button and then sub, hit the bell for the notifications so you'll know when new decks or Rivals of Ixalan spoilers come out. Got a feeling there's going to be some of those really, really soon. So make sure you sub and hit the bell. You can also follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev so you can know when new videos are coming out, or for witty insights occasionally. You can also, if you really feel like it, throw me a buck on Patreon here. And for just $1, you get to know what decks we're doing the day before we do them. That's valuable information. Just go to patreon.com/SBMTG. But anyway, I'm pretty sure I'm officially tapped out for this one. I sincerely hope you guys have a good holiday, no matter what holiday you celebrate, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. And it's easy to forget in these trying times, but try to remember, spread love, be kind.